Inside the halls of San Diego State University lies a program dedicated to storytelling and pursuing the truth. Welcome to Where You At, a podcast that takes you inside the work of alumni for the School of Journalism and Media Studies at San Diego State. Our goal is to show the success of our alumni, inspire students with the stories, and connect students and alums on a pathway to journalism success. And now, here's your host, Josh Suchon.
This week on the Where You At podcast, we're heading out to the Rocky Mountains, Arvada, Colorado to be precise, and we're going to discuss what it's like working for an advertising agency. Our guest is Brook Bentley. She attended San Diego State from 2007 through 2011. She's an account director at KPS3, not KPBS, KPS3. She works with local and national clients, digital marketing that helps businesses grow, and data-driven social media content. I'm sure a whole lot more that we're about to find out about. Brook, thank you for joining us and welcome to the Where You At podcast.
Thanks, Josh. It's great to be here. I'm super excited to talk with you guys, and it's been a really fun trip down memory lane, reflecting back on all my time at San Diego State and the J School.
Yeah, well, I can't wait to find out about that. But first, let's start with what you do now. KPS3, again, not KPBS. Tell us, what is KPS3 and kind of what's a normal week like for you in your job?
Yeah, absolutely. So KPS3 is a full service marketing agency, kind of like you mentioned. So we do everything from branding to PR in the digital space. And we get the opportunity to work with a variety of clients, from nonprofits to the travel sector and large scale B2B and SaaS companies. So a little bit across the board. My role specifically as an account director is a big blend. So I get the opportunity to lead larger, complex projects and work with larger, more complex clients. The day-to-day for me looks a little bit like a variety of day-to-day communications with our clients, developing strategic recommendations, project management, team coordination, some budget management in the mix. So kind of get to put on a lot of hats throughout the day and every week. So
is there some clients that you'd like to shout out that you can just tell us, well, we work with this client and these are the specific things that we do in order to try to help this client's business grow?
Yeah. So we really try to tailor everything we do to a specific client need. But a couple that I've been working on just before we started talking today is I was working with the Reno Airport, working on a full campaign that we're working on for them. A lot of stuff in the digital space about some flight awareness and all the different flight options that are available through the Reno Airport, which is fun. Also have an industrial real estate client that I work a lot with. We've been doing some fun stuff, getting them prepped for the holiday season with some nonprofit connections that they do and some giving opportunities they focus on around the Thanksgiving holiday.
All right. So one of my favorite things is the how it started and how it's going now. So we got a little bit about what you're doing now. Now let's go back. And this has become my favorite question on this podcast. Why San Diego State and why journalism and media studies? Let's hear your reasoning, Brook.
Absolutely. So I grew up in Lake Tahoe, so I was fortunate to have a beautiful surrounding there. And I had the opportunity to visit San Diego quite a bit when I was younger and through my high school years due to some family being in the area. And I was just really drawn to being a little fish in a big pond. I grew up in a small town, and so San Diego kind of piqued my interest in being able to have a big city around me and a lot of opportunity. And I think, as many have said in conversations you've had with them, once you walk around the campus at San Diego State, you kind of feel at home pretty quickly there, and you can see yourself spending a lot of time on campus. So that's actually what drew me there. And yeah, got my chance to be that little fish in a big pond.
Why journalism? Was it something from a very early age that you watched, that you practiced, or what was it about journalism and just creating different types of stories that drew you to it?
Absolutely. So I actually started my journey at San Diego State undeclared. I didn't know what I wanted to study when I got there. I knew I wanted to be in that area, but that was about it. And I think it was somewhere right in my freshman year. I was either in like a communications, or it might have been like a lit class of some sort. And I found myself really gravitating towards JMS and everything that it had to offer. But I think, like many people who end up in that space, I had a love for like communications and different styles of writing from a young age. And so I feel like I was always in a book of some kind or keeping a diary of some kind or finding different ways to communicate information. So I think the JMS space felt like home for me once I kind of found my groove there into that section.
So I'm trying to go back through my memory here of social media. So if you were a freshman in 2007, I want to say 2007, 2008 is when Facebook started to become a thing. Instagram was still many years away. Twitter, I think, was still a couple of years away. So what was as you first decided to get into this space, social media, we had no idea back then. Maybe give us the evolution of how you discovered what might be your path within this field.
Yeah, I really liked the fact that there was a lot of flexibility within JMS, but I remember one of my first classes I took was focused all on media content and how different content affects audiences and societies, but it was heavily focused on like television advertising and everything like that, because you're spot on. Social media wasn't really around just yet. It was still, prompts on Facebook and everything like that. We weren't really in the mix of what it is today by any means. And I remember going through that and I was like, man, it's going to be such an interesting time looking ahead with all these different ways that people are interacting. And we were like just on the cusp of things like that coming around. And that really sort of piqued my interest into that direction of things and the impact that all these different types of advertising or communication platforms can have on people over time. So as I worked through the J school, and my time in like JMS, I landed in a focus of media studies. I found it so interesting to be able to look closely at different channels and mediums and how people interacted with them, and kind of that hybrid model as we were transforming into a much more digital age, shifting from what had been studied and the information that was there and what was going to be right in front of us at any given moment. So with that, I kind of found my space in just being curious about what was going to come next. And I think that really kind of took me in my next steps for where I wanted to go eventually after college. And I might be jumping ahead of your question here slightly, but when I did graduate in 2011, it was also such an interesting time because the job market was unfriendly to college graduates, to say the least. And so it was kind of interesting because you were competing in a space where people had so much more experience than you in the job world. And you were almost expected to have this existing knowledge of social media platforms and other tools that had just come out and people were still learning about. So it's kind of an interesting space to be in, to have focused on learning so much about different ways and mediums and how people interact with them, because I feel like it gave me the interest and the drive to continue learning consistently, even after college, to be able to kind of get caught up on what was happening in the digital space.
Curious is always a very good thing. That might be the most important skill for anyone who's studying some form of journalism. Before we skip further ahead to your transition after college, just other great memories, whether it's a journalism class or a non-journalism class, just like events, like, kind of get sentimental here. What are some of your favorite memories of attending San Diego State?
Yeah, I did love the school side of things at San Diego State. I had a lot of friends who found different paths within the JMS space, whether that was into public relations or true journalism and everything. So it was so cool to watch all the different paths people were able to take. And for me, it was really a great opportunity to just do some soul searching. I think starting Undeclared and then finding my way into JMS was great. But I also studied abroad, and those were some of my best memories for sure of the time that I was there and how easy San Diego State made that process for me. And then I was reflecting back on, some of the classes and everything. And it's amazing the impact some people can really have on you. And one of the best memories I could reflect on, I can't remember, I was doing some digging on professors' names and I can't remember for the life of me. But I remember taking a technical writing class at one point when I was at San Diego State, and they had us get up in front of the entire class and actually talk through our technical writing that we were working on. And the person next to you had to follow your instructions. So whether you were making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, or you were trying to lace a pair of shoes, or whatever you might have been doing in that moment, you got to see the real work in progress. And it was such a memorable thing in terms of communications and how that kind of layers into life beyond college as well, of just how people can interpret things so differently, depending on what you're talking about.
Okay, so as you said that, you just brought back a memory of mine that I had totally forgotten. And it was some type of class assignment where the teacher, the instructor said to person A, this is the story. And then that person had to tell the story to the next student, and then the next student, and the next student. And I forget how many different ways that it was moved around. But then finally, the final student in the chain had to then say the story based on how they heard it. And so then the first student compared and contrasted the accuracy of the final person's version of it. And it was the ultimate example of how the story changes from person to person. And I felt like it was one of the best learning tools for journalism in terms of how we hear something, how we disseminate it, and then how that continues. And that's basically gossip, right? And I don't know where the question is going with this, but you just made me remember this great lesson that I learned in the classroom that was kind of similar.
Yeah. I think it was just such a cool way. I think this example I'm sharing is so similar to what you're saying too. You just really get this perception of how, words written on a piece of paper can be interpreted so differently, depending on who's receiving them or the space that they might be in when they're receiving that message, and how important that is to keep in mind through all kinds of communication, whether it's written or visual or any of that.
You mentioned studying abroad. That's one of my regrets, is that I did not study abroad. If there's anything I could do differently, well, there's three things. I would have taken Spanish more seriously. I would have gotten class credit for surfing, and I would have studied abroad. So tell us make me jealous. Tell us your version of studying abroad, where you went and how that made you this more well-rounded person.
Yeah, absolutely. I also wish I had focused on my Spanish more. That's such a good one. I was able to do a program called Semester at Sea. And so I lived on a ship for a semester of college and actually went to like 12 or 13 different countries during that time. So the exposure to different types of people and lifestyles and you name it was really insane. And it was such a cool experience. And I really think it actually enabled my love for communications, because as we were talking about just a little bit ago, social media wasn't super prevalent at that point. So access to the internet was pretty limited, and we had to pay for it if we wanted access to it. And so I naturally started tracking really long emails, like almost blog format-esque, to share all my experiences back with family and friends. And everyone always asks what my favorite place was and all that experience. And it's so difficult to pick one. But one of the places I've had an opportunity to revisit since my travels was Japan. And I truly loved that. And I hope to get to go back again, actually. I need a redemption trip for some skiing.
That sounds wonderful. Just wonderful. All right. So now let's get into the transition. Now, I know you went back to school as well. You went to the University of Nevada at Reno to get your MBA. Tell us about some of the different decisions that you made and this bad job market in 2011 and going back to get additional education.
Yeah, definitely. So you're spot on. So graduating college in 2011, looking at the job market was a big challenge. I had spent some time in college working for the athletic department at San Diego State, which I really enjoyed, kind of doing a blend of a little bit of like event stuff and just some general organization for the athletic department. And so that kind of found me in a spot where I had some skills, but competing for a big job was, like I said, challenging. And so I found myself in a space where I was working with what's the best way to call it? Like a sports social club in San Diego that was putting on all kinds of social sporting, whether it was like soccer, flag football, softball, you name it. And then I was picking up some blogging work on the side to do some SEO optimizations, which were just starting to become a thing, and updating content a lot. So I did that for a long time. Before I found myself moving into a space as a digital content manager for a weekly business publication in the Reno area. And that was a really cool experience because it actually took a lot of what I had learned throughout college and studying all these different platforms and mediums of ways people were communicating and bringing it all together into the digital space. So the publication I started working for didn't have an online presence. They had been heavily driven by weekly publications being sent out to various business organizations in the community, but they desperately needed an online presence. So I kind of felt like everything was a little serendipitous and coming together from kind of the time and space that I'd been in college and some of this digital stuff just coming around into really the focal point of everything and getting to put that to use. And when I started doing that, I think I eventually found I liked business, which if you had asked me in my undergrad, I would not have agreed with. I couldn't have been more thrilled to end up in JMS and not be doing statistics and you name it on the business side of things. But the time I spent getting to know the business world a bit more with that time as a digital content manager, I found that I did want to carve out some time in that space. So the thread for me that really continued to pull me through was just identifying different mediums and the right opportunities for messaging. And I had the opportunity to build some long-lasting partnerships for the business publication with entities like the regional NPR affiliate in Reno, which is KUNR, and finding different ways to share what had traditionally only ever been written in print out on broadcast or whatever other channels we found to be appropriate, and drifted into some social media as part of that as well, because now front and center, social media is kind of in the middle of everything these days. And then, yeah, I did go back to school and I got my MBA, my master's in business, and I focus in project management. So I use that a lot now in my current role, doing a good amount of project management and just day-to-day stuff and figuring out marketing and everything like that. But again, that same thread has held true for me even in my current role with our clients. We're constantly taking that time to take a really strategic look at everything and figure out what mediums their message should be on. Where are we going to find that target audience? Are they going to be receptive to that message? Are they going to be in a space where when the telephone game completes, that they're going to remember the message at the end? Do we want them to remember the message at the end? So that sort of curiosity and ever wondering the right place for the right message has really been that theme that has carried me through most of my career at this point.
So you mentioned you're able to make contacts with this company and that company. And I just think, again, I love that word serendipitous and just the different people that you meet and how you might accidentally meet them or how you really wisely target. These are the different types of people who I meet. What are some of the key decisions that you made? Who were some of the key people who you met where it opened up a door that opened up the next door that allowed you to get to where you were?
Yeah, that's such a great question. A lot of the space I ended up in with a publication that had heavily been focused on its print readership base and really had been focused on maintaining what they were able to within that space. There weren't a lot of resources available to try and invest in digital in a super strong way. So part of what I figured out was there were some really good groups that had people experiencing similar challenges. So they were regional groups and organizations that were really focused on offering some resources or other ways to approach that transition from print only to other mediums. And I think those networking opportunities did really allow, at least for like a safe space, to have a conversation where no one was going to judge what your approach or what your thought process was. And I think some of those really open-ended conversations helped get me the resources I needed. And as part of the content management role, I was also doing some writing. So I was also producing content. So getting to be in that interview space as a journalist and having conversations with people, I think always affords you such a different perspective of how people come into life and how they think through things. And so I think naturally as a journalist, you're ever curious. And so when an interview conversation would end, just being able to kind of continue chatting with some people about where they were in their life and what opportunities or maybe where they find their news if it wasn't in our publication, and identifying some segues and some opportunities beyond that to build more partnerships.
You made me just think of something, and I don't know how good of a question this is going to be for you, but when I look back on that time in, say, the late 2000s, early 2010s into mid 2010s there, especially with journalism, there's a lot of decisions that people had to make. Are we going to still put everything in a newspaper first and then just put it online for free? Are we going to have a paywall? Are we going to put something online first? Whether it was a newspaper or a TV station, whether it was a digital marketing place, whether it was a marketing place that was making this transition. And some places were all about let me just dive right into this new digital space. And some people were like, I'm going to dip my toes into this and I'm going to see. And now we know how it ended up. And again, I'm trying to think of like just the best way to phrase this question, but I'm just curious your experiences about which companies wanted to dive into this new digital space and which ones really wanted to take their time and how those decisions have impacted their long-term future.
I actually think this is a great question for kind of what you're getting at. So I found that a lot of companies or groups that were just like throwing all the paint at the wall at the start of everything going digital never quite found their space of where they wanted to fit in all of it. I think that they felt the volume of the content was much more important than the specifics or maybe the core message within some of that content. And I think over time, it really gets lost in all the noise that's out there. The companies or the groups that I've worked with that have been a little more strategic and slowed down and spend some of the time thinking at the start of that or questioning maybe where their audience is or who they're trying to ultimately speak with, I think had greater success in that. And actually, to reflect a little bit on my past career. So when I started with the weekly business publication, we were a group of local newspapers that were owned by a larger company, as happened with many print publications getting picked up by some larger groups. And then a lot of those larger groups started to look at how they could diversify what had been a very profitable industry and how it was going to sustain into the future. And I had a colleague who was regionally located, ironically, in Colorado. I was not physically in Colorado at the time, but she was here. And she had been tasked with the similar piece of the puzzle I was working on in the Nevada region of taking all the content online. But she had had this idea of how to resurface evergreen content, which wasn't very common at the time, of finding ways to update SEO within older content or older stories that maybe would have benefited from backlinks throughout other parts of a news site or relatable information. And she put together a very impressive mapping tool to figure out how all of these things could have a common thread or if there were shared interests. And the strategy that went into all of it was like very successful for the group of publications she was working on at the time. And we leveraged a lot of that work as well into what we did to put together a true strategy for how things could move forward. And I think the groups that had the opportunity to pause and do that were able to kind of find their space of where the information they had should go out. Whereas I think when people just started to throw a lot of paint at the wall, it was a challenge because you'd see people coming up with, you know, very interesting photos or like stock photos of some kind that maybe weren't actually accurate of their brand just to be out on digital. And I think the authenticity behind it becomes apparent pretty quickly. If anybody does, you know, a few clicks of digging, you feel that authenticity is lost. So it's a long way to answer your question by saying, I think those that were able to slow down and take a beat to look at the strategy of how they wanted to communicate were more successful than just going all in and throwing every piece of info in every space as quickly as they could.
I am a huge believer in recycling evergreen content as often as possible, because to give one example, if someone is going to say Lake Tahoe where you grew up and like, what is there to do? Okay, some places might be closed, right? The hours might be different, but for the most part, what there was to do in Lake Tahoe 20 years ago is not all that different than what it is now. Again, maybe there's some roads that are different, some hours that are different. And so I love the idea of this is just as relevant now, or it's almost just as relative, especially if we just change things up a little bit as it was 5 years ago or 10 years ago. I just think it's really smart.
Yeah. And I think now more than ever, we are in such an age where we're constantly consuming information that some of that reflection back to that evergreen content or whatever it is, it almost feels like safe. It's like, you're like, oh, wait, this is still familiar to me. Like parts of it might be different or new, but I remember this from a different time. Or it feels like something I've read before. And so it feels like naturally like you belong in that information, like using your Lake Tahoe example exactly. There's a bit of nostalgia there of things you might remember. And while some of the pieces may have changed along the way, the bigger message is still exactly what you want. You're like, okay, these are still the places I want to go while I'm here.
I want to talk to you a little bit more about your current job now, KPS3, as we move back toward where it all began in this conversation. I saw that they made a custom beer label featuring your dog.
Oh, yeah. I have one right here.
This is adorable. This seems like a really, I mean, this is what, because 5 years at the company, this seems like a really good company if they're going to make a custom beer label featuring your dog.
Yeah, it was such a cool surprise. So I certainly didn't know it was happening. And one of the designers at our company who I've had the opportunity to work with over the years that I've been here was the one to focus on the project. And it was really a collaborative effort. So a few different people that I work with had asked me some really miscellaneous questions like, what kind of dog is Biggie again? And I would be like, oh, he's a mutt. He's a mix of this and that, we think, I've had him forever. And I didn't realize there were all these little like breadcrumbs going on to put together the beer label. And then I had our COO actually pull me into a super last minute meeting. He was like, hey, I need to talk to you. And I was like, oh, shoot. I was like, what's going on? And he pulled me into this call to have our designer present the beer label to me as a acknowledgement of my 5 years at the company and to celebrate that. So it was really cool. They did a blend of a little bit of AI stuff to kind of pull together the visual that looks like my dog and then to continue to kind of tinker with the final label. So it was super fun. It's my mission now because I have a whole bunch of them that I have to find some fun places to leave them. But so far, it's only been like on a few friends' cars, and I mailed one to my mom. So
Well, I feel like this could be a really fun project too, of like where else to put the beer labels as well for your dog. Okay, so I also saw on LinkedIn that you recently did a photo shoot with some of your colleagues in Illinois. You started to talk about it a little bit at the very beginning. Let's kind of talk through like what are the goals when you say, okay, we're going to fly out, we're going to get these photos, these videos. Talk us through the goals of what you're hoping to accomplish and how the final product ultimately turned out.
yeah, absolutely. So this is a little bit of a unique opportunity that presented itself to us through a customer of our client. So we work with the industrial real estate client really closely, and they had a customer that was very willing to let us come into their space and take these photos and videos along the way so that we could capture some real people. And it's a unique blend because the industry itself is really focused on these Class A logistics warehouse spaces that are heavily usable for companies and everything that most people touch nowadays, whether that's buying something online or returning something physically to a store that also ends up in a distribution location or any type of variety of that. So to be able to show real people in these spaces was our big goal. So finding a way that we could show the life that does come into what feels like a relatively empty space sometimes. So working closely with our creative team and then our photo and video production team to kind of define that vision more clearly of what we wanted to do and the concept that we wanted to fulfill with that. And then getting to physically end up in the location and doing a little bit of scouting ahead of time. So going and taking a walk around and hoping that the weather in Illinois in September was going to hold out for us, which it did, which we were really thankful for, to get the drone up in the air and get some aerial shots and everything as well. And then working really closely while we're physically there with the customer to be sure that they're feeling good about what we're going around and capturing in that time, and really being collaborative to share those assets with them. The company we got to work with there is called Double Good, and their mission is very cool. They give 50%, I think, of their profits back to communities, like different organizations, whether it's like a little league baseball team raising funds or like family reunions raising funds, you name it. But even when there isn't an affiliated connection, like a little league baseball team or something like that, they still have a whole nonprofit that they operate that 50% of their revenue goes into to be able to invest back into communities all through popcorn sales. So it was kind of a win-win to also be able to go into a space that was basically full of popcorn, not being actively made, just being put into boxes. But yeah, so then at the end of all that, our goal with it is to be able to bring that human element into the space. So whether that's going to be digitally online or through social media or different brochures or templates that are ultimately needed. And then, like I mentioned, sharing those assets back with the customer as well in appreciation for them letting us come into their space for a day and steal some people off the floor to take some photos and everything. So
is there any other favorite projects that you've had during your 5 years now with KPS3 that you think would be pertinent for this conversation? Just something that you really enjoyed and there's lessons that we can learn from what you liked about working on that project.
Yeah, I think another one that comes to mind is as the pandemic happened, there was a lot of shifting in how people were investing in their marketing. The push to be in a digital space was stronger than ever. And it wasn't necessarily the right place to be, but they had a captive audience, right? I mean, people were home, they were consuming a lot of content, whether that was, through streaming or social media or just cruising the web, Google searches and whatever else. And so at that time, we had a couple clients that we really had to reposition our entire channel strategies and how we were approaching their marketing to be sure that we could be the best stewards of what they needed to do and who they were trying to communicate with. And one of the examples that really comes to mind for me as part of that was a product that we were working with at the time that had been really successful in different types of sort of like one-off sale situations. So, and it was a product that people wanted to physically touch. And so that obviously wasn't happening during the pandemic. So kind of finding a way to shift that around and still be able to have a conversation with people about how they could land on this.
This is a really basic question, but I think it's a really important question. And that is, how do you know that it's successful? Whether it's something that you put on social media, whether it's something that you put digitally, whether it is something that you can touch, whether it's a one-off. Obviously, you want the client to be happy. And if the client is happy, then it's successful. But what are the other ways that you and your colleagues at KPS3 know that something that you did was successful?
On the client side, obviously, we like to define what success looks like early on with the client. So whether that's something just looking and feeling good, whether it's success in sales, kind of defining those parameters. But internally at KPS3, we also we call it boss level work sometimes. And for us, it's a set of goals that we put forth in certain projects that really elevate our work because of something we want to achieve internally. So it may be something that we've never done before or something that's new for a client or just a whole different way that we want to approach something. A good example of this is we had a client that we'd been working with for a really long time, and we had never fully defined a public relations plan for them. And we do a lot of public relations for them. Feels like counterintuitive, right? You're like, wait, you're already doing the work. Why do you need to go back and have a plan? But what we were finding is the defining of success became more and more challenging, whether it was how we felt success was feeling in the work that we were producing, or if it was how the client was feeling and saying like, okay, this is great, but now what? So putting together this plan really let us take a step back and examine what we were doing, if we wanted to keep doing it, and how we were going to continue that approach. And it really led us to find some key media themes that we wanted to be sure came into play for this client. So we kind of grouped some stuff into some different buckets of philanthropy and thought leadership and some other areas to be sure that we could focus in our efforts on those to be sure we felt in line. And the plan was all put together and it felt really good. And for us on the KPS3 side, it was considered a boss level project because we hadn't had the opportunity to carve out this space just by the way that the work had grown. And so to be able to stop and do that and really put together some thought and intention felt really good for that as well.
Love that so much. All right, we're going to start to wrap things up. But before we do, I always like to give guests on this podcast just sort of like the open floor of maybe something that I should have asked that I didn't, something that you think is really important based on our conversation. It can be advice that you want to give to students or people who weren't students for a long time ago. Just anything else you'd like to add that I probably should have asked and didn't.
Yeah. The whole exercise of Josh, of you reaching out to have this conversation was such a fun reflection to be able to look back on what my time at San Diego State had actually meant for me, where it led me in my career, and actually kind of figuring out this thread that has stayed consistent throughout my career up to this point. And it's all really driven from what had started as just genuine curiosity at the point that I decided I wanted to focus in my time on media studies in the JMS space. And really figuring out how to best use different channels to communicate messages. And so I think for me, the biggest piece is just like, you have to try things that make you uncomfortable. And I feel like when you're younger, it's so hard to do that. I feel like being a little older and having a little perspective and looking back at my time, it's easy to say that. But had that genuine curiosity not come up for me as an 18-year-old undeclared at San Diego State, I don't know that I would have that same thread that I do now. And it was really just driven by something that had made me a little uncomfortable, but had piqued my interest at the time, and kind of carried through my career as I kind of reflect back on that now, as it's a space I continue to always have curiosity about.
I think it's important that we always try things that make us uncomfortable. And I can say that even when you get much older, sometimes it gets harder to try things, right? Because you get set in your ways and you're like, I just want to do things that I'm good at. But I think that's a really good lesson, to try things that make us uncomfortable. It's okay to try. If you fail, so what? Try again.
Yeah, I think so for sure. And I actually wanted to come back to your question that you had asked me earlier about some examples. I think we were talking specifically about during the pandemic, right? Of some examples of some winning stories. So working with the Reno airport, travel during the pandemic was such an interesting situation because everything came to a dead halt. And then slowly, and then not so slowly, things picked back up, and revenge travel sort of got its day in the sun, and people really wanted to get out in such a different capacity. And we put together what ended up being an award-winning campaign for the airport that was actually all focused on nostalgia and that feeling of being able to go back to the beach with your family, or down into the South to be able to eat barbecue food, or whatever those big feelings that you didn't get to experience when you were isolated during the times of COVID. And so I think that example of kind of being patient and finding that way to communicate that sentiment to people really can go a long way too.
Yeah, I like it. And great memory to go back to that.
Yeah, I was like, I'm going to come up with one. I didn't have it when we were talking about it, but I was like, I know it's there somewhere.
All right, Brooke, we like to close out the podcast by asking guests to reflect on other San Diego State alums who they want to give shout outs to, who they're proud of for whatever reason. Doesn't matter what their industry is. It can be a friend, it can be someone who you don't know at all, but brag about someone else from San Diego State who's making us proud.
Yeah. Okay. So I did come back around to this too. So I had to think back to a couple of girlfriends that I actually met when I lived in the dorms at San Diego State. And I think about where they are now. And I have to think briefly. So when I knew both of them, they were Katie Brown and Jen, but they both have been married now. So I have to think about the married names. So it's going to be Katie Driver and Jen Acosta. And neither of them were in the J school, but they are just great people who have really found their way in life and spent a long time in San Diego after that. And then they both jumped all the way to the East Coast in the last few years. But it's been great to watch their successes from the times that I knew them as freshmen in college all the way through the rest of their lives too.
Yeah, it's super fun when you meet someone in the dorms and then you're still friends with them years and years later and you see their paths and all that. It's super fun.
Yeah.
All right, Brooke, this conversation was super fun. Thank you so much for your time and your stories and your memory. And it's just great having you as a guest here on the Where You At podcast.
Yeah. Thank you, Josh. I greatly appreciate your time. And whenever you need a good concert, come on up to Denver.
Oh, let's go. Red Rocks, my all-time favorite place to watch a concert.
Yes.
All right.
Absolutely.
Again, her name is Brook Bentley. She is an account director at KPS3. My name is Josh Suchon. I'm your host for the Where You At podcast. We appreciate you listening. Recommend us a guest. Press that subscribe button and get back in touch in your own way with the university in some fashion. We will talk to you again next week.
Thanks for listening to the Where You At podcast. This is Devin Watley from the class of 2021. Thanks to Martine Marine for creating the music you're hearing right now, and Alex Piscatelli for her work on the podcast name and artwork on social media. And a reminder to SDSU alums, we really want to know where you're at. Tell us about your career. Get involved in the school. There's many ways you can do this, from donating your time or money, mentoring students, to even speaking in classrooms in person or on Zoom. Your work can help us grow the program and create more opportunities for our students to succeed. Again, thanks for listening. Subscribe to this podcast. Tell your friends. Recommend us a future guest. And go Aztecs.